Hello everyone, we are coming in for this week's next video. So this will be our last video here for the month of August. We will not have another till September, which is next week. Hard to think of it, August has flown through this quickly. But as always, we are going to wrap out the month with our next in the President video series, trying to cover all the presidents up to close to modern day. We'll end up determining future on how far we go to modern day. But for today's video, for those of you who are not aware, last president video we did back in July, we had covered the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, who was sandwiched in between Grover Cleveland's 2 terms, and in June we had covered Cleveland, and Cleveland got, so far he is the only president in American history to have gotten 2 terms that weren't consecutive, so far at least. I don't know what's going to happen in November, but there is the possibility there that could happen again. I don't know what's going to happen yet, but so technically, we're picking up in about 1897 in terms of the presidency, and this is after Cleveland has left his 2nd term of office. He decides he's not going for a 3rd term, and his replacement ends up being President William McKinley. This is McKinley. McKinley is another Ohio president. He is going to be from the Buckeye State. I've actually had the privilege of going to see his tomb over in Canton, and it is almost like a miniature almost of something that you would see out of Washington, D.C. It's actually quite impressive to see how they have it laid out. So McKinley is going to be our topic for today's video, and as always, for those of you who aren't aware, we typically go through a little biography of the president pretty much. We go through their early life, before they were president, then we hit through the presidency, and then if anything, afterward. Unfortunately, with this video, McKinley is not going to get much of an afterward because he is going to be our 3rd president who actually ends up getting assassinated. He is killed at the very beginning of his 2nd term, much like Lincoln had been almost 30 or 40 years before. So William McKinley is our 25th president from 1897 to 1901, and he was born on January 29th of 1843 in the town of Niles, Ohio. He was the 7th out of 9 children, and his father, William McKinley Sr., his full name was actually William McKinley Jr., but we typically leave out the junior part in his name. But his father, William McKinley Sr., was involved in running iron foundries throughout the state of Ohio. The family was staunchly Methodist growing up, and that would have a massive impact on McKinley throughout his entire life. He would constantly kind of implement the Methodist religious principles that he had learned in church, and throughout his life, he actually remained a Methodist by religion. In 1852, when McKinley was only 9 years old, him and his family ended up moving to Poland, Ohio, so that he and his siblings could attend better schools. It was a move made mostly by their parents for the betterment of their children, not because of any strict financial situation, but they wanted to ensure that their children got the best education that they could possibly afford to give them. McKinley would graduate from the Poland Seminary School in 1859, and he would then briefly attend Allegheny College in Pennsylvania before returning home to become a school teacher. So McKinley doesn't really go into politics right off the bat. He doesn't go into the lawyer profession off the bat. He goes to college, he decides, I'm going to be a school teacher, comes back home. Unfortunately, this is right around 1860, so we know very well in American history what is going on at that time. The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected. The southern states don't like that he is anti-slavery, and they decide that they are going to try to secede from the Union, which then leads to 1861, with the firing on Fort Sumter in April, with the breakout of the American Civil War. McKinley, like many young men at that time, felt that it was his patriotic duty to defend the Union, and he was one of those volunteers that went off to war in the Civil War. McKinley, because of this, he ended up being the last American president to have been a veteran of the Civil War. After McKinley, no president after him had fought in the Civil War. So it's almost like the passing of the torch of a new generation. He's the last of the Civil War presidents. McKinley, he and his cousin would enlist in the Poland Guards when the war began in 1861 voluntarily. They voluntarily enlisted, and the Poland Guards unit would actually be merged into the 23rd Ohio Infantry very shortly after their mustering in. Now, while they were in the Union Army, McKinley and his cousin, they weren't always on the best of agreements with the way that their company was run, that the way that the 23rd Ohio Infantry was managed and commanded. They had problems with the command, but McKinley kind of had a shining spot that come through during his time in the war, as he met a very good friend that was a fellow member of his company and later one of the commanders, and that was Rutherford B. Hayes, who would become the 19th president. So McKinley did have a relationship, a good friendship with future President Hayes. They served in the same company during the war, and Hayes somewhat became somewhat of a mentor to McKinley in many ways. He kind of served as the voice of reason and the voice of, don't challenge the orders, don't question them, just follow them through, do them to the best of your ability. They became very good friends, and they maintained that relationship all the way until Hayes's death in 1893. So it was a lifelong friendship after that point. McKinley, during his time in the 23rd Ohio Infantry, he was present and fought most notably at the Battle of Antietam in the September of 1862, the one that saw the Union victory that allowed Lincoln to proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he would end up leaving the Army after war's end in 1865 with the rank of brevet major. So that was McKinley's time in the military. So, like many Civil War volunteers, as soon as the war was over, he didn't really want to pursue a career in the military. He had been urged by a couple of friends to remain in the military, as he was a good soldier, they said, but he chose that that's not my profession. I've done my duty. The war's over. We've saved the Union. I'm out. So he leaves in 1865. Upon returning to Ohio, McKinley would end up studying law and then starting a law practice in Canton, Ohio. There, he would meet Ida Saxton, who was pretty much the belle of the town. She was the daughter of a local prominent banker. And they would end up courting for a while before eventually being married on January 25th of 1871. They would end up having 2 daughters. Unfortunately for the McKinleys, these 2 daughters did not really last long. They died at a very young, early age. Both of them did. And this put Ida in a very unhappy and a very fraught situation. After the deaths of her 2 daughters and subsequently her own mother, Ida became very frail. She became basically an invalid, and she was very weak. She was very prone to having seizures, among other things. And McKinley quickly turned, even though he's starting his own political law career out, he takes the time to attend to his wife, who is having these medical issues. As such, when Ida would become First Lady, she wasn't able to do a whole lot in her role of First Lady. It was difficult for her to do many things. And then, of course, the death of her husband did not help her frail situation either. And she ended up dying a few years after McKinley's own death, but it was said that every day she would go and visit his tomb in Canton. But William patiently cared for Ida during her situation after the death of their 2 daughters and her mother, and this actually won him public praise for his devotion to her, for how he was being a caring husband and devoted husband even though he was in politics. In 1876, McKinley was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Republican. He had joined the Republican Party, and he would spend 14 years on from there in Congress. During his time in the House, he would serve as chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he was a proponent of economic protectionism, which is going to become a very big thing for McKinley. It's one of his most defining features. He is the tariff man. McKinley believes that American businesses are best protected if tariffs are placed on imports from foreign countries in order to protect the jobs and products and sales of American workers and businesses. So McKinley becomes basically the god of economic protectionism, and he believes in high tariffs on imported goods in order to achieve this. In 1890, McKinley lent his name to a new tariff law that he had sponsored that we had discussed in our previous video with Benjamin Harrison, because Benjamin Harrison himself had helped support this measure that became known as the McKinley Tariff Act. And the McKinley Tariff Act raised tariff rates on imports from 38% to an almost all-time high in American history of 49.5%. It was one of the largest, if not the largest, tariff increase ever done by the American government, by the American Congress. Due to rising consumer prices, though, that came in a coordination with that, because many people like to jump on tariffs and say, oh, they're so good, they'll protect us. Well, they can, but if you go too far overboard with it, you also don't realize the impact that thing can have on suppliers and manufacturers in America having to get parts from overseas, and now they're having to pay twice as much for those parts because they're imported. They don't have the infrastructure or the sellers here in the United States to get them. So where do you think they pass the costs down to? They pass it down to the consumer. So consumer prices, as a response of the McKinley Tariff Act, end up going up, which is not a good thing. And this ends up backfiring on McKinley and the Republicans because as those consumer prices go up, as the manufacturers pass down those costs to the consumer, McKinley and the other Republicans get rejected by the voters in that following election in 1890, and which leads to McKinley being voted out of office and then returning to Ohio by 1891. So his support of the act that bared his name actually kind of backfired on him massively, and Republicans as a whole, and gave Democrats the edge in the upcoming 1892 election to oust Harrison and put Cleveland back in. Here, a couple images here. But it's okay. So here is an image of McKinley. This one here is about 15 years old. So this would be right about 1858. So probably about the time or so that he had graduated, was getting near graduation. Be about 15 years old here in this picture. Here is an image of McKinley when he was in the Civil War. This is from 1865 when he mustered out his Civil War uniform. This picture was taken, of course, by the noted Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. And here we have an image. This is an image of Ida, his wife, who he would marry. She was the belle of Canton when he had married her. She ended up becoming very frail in health, which caused her to miss a lot of public events and stuff like that. And McKinley constantly was a devoted husband to her and cared for her well-being whenever he possibly could, would even take time out of work just to do it. So very devoted to his wife. And let's see here. Picture of him, I believe, from his representative days. Yes, and this is when McKinley was a representative in the U.S. Congress from Ohio. So this will probably be about the 1870s, 1880s that this photo was probably taken. So in 1891, after returning home after being voted out of the U.S. House, partly due to his role in the McKinley Tariff Act, McKinley actually would choose to run for Ohio governor and ended up winning by a very narrow majority. He was not all that popular nationally, and his popularity had taken a hit at home too, but he still had enough to clinch the governorship during that 1891 election. McKinley would end up serving 2 terms as governor and would be governor of Ohio from 1892 until 1896. During his time as governor, the Panic of 1893 had then set in, which turned the tables for McKinley and the Republicans to regain the political advantage from the Democratic Party. And in 1896, upon leaving office as Ohio governor, McKinley decided to seek the Republican presidential nomination, and the Republicans in large part were willing to support him due to his prominent stature within the party, his very big role in advocating protectionist tariffs, and he was a big name for the Republicans at the time, and many of them saw as a perfect candidate to put forward. Of course, he also had a hand from his good friend, fellow wealthy Ohio industrialist, Mark Hanna. And Mark Hanna would partly do it out of the expectation that he would get some political favors done by McKinley in return for help in getting him into the nomination and help getting him elected. And he did getting a few. And this was his friend that was very instrumental in getting him the nomination and even the election in 1896. This was Mark Hanna out of Ohio that was responsible for that. And McKinley would win the Republican nomination due to his congressional career and gubernatorial experience, and he would also decide to back the wealthy Ohio. He would also decide that he was going to put forward strictly the economic prosperity motive, that I can bring America back into economic prosperity through my tariff suggestions and everything else. And if you give me 1 second here, I am going to get an image of his opponent here. I did not think to really print off real quick. But McKinley's opponent in the 1896 election was the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan was a very noted politician within the Democratic Party. He was an excellent orator. He was possibly one of the best orators in American political history. And he was very known for being able to convince whole crowds of, whatever talking point that he was trying to make. And right there is a good image of him right there from the actual 1896 campaign. So we will go ahead here. I'll see if I can get that printed off real quick, just so we can see what he looked like. And he very much like McKinley. He's a little bit younger than McKinley, if I'm not wrong, but a very dashing, handsome figure that was very popular at the time for what people were maybe looking for in a presidential candidate. It says, yes, he was quite younger than McKinley. He was almost 20 years younger. But this here, see it? This here is McKinley's Democratic opponent. This was William Jennings Bryan. This picture was taken in October of 1896 while he was campaigning, giving a speech. And Bryan and him are almost neck and neck for a long bit of the 1896 race. They are arguing over the economics of America. And one major issue that comes up in the 1896 presidential campaign is the debate over whether the United States should have a gold-backed currency, the gold standard that had already been implemented and remained mostly throughout American history, or if it should go to a silver coinage, to advocate more silver coinage, of which Bryan of the Democratic Party was willing to do. William Jennings Bryan was very much in favor of allowing silver coinage, and he attacked the gold standard as serving nothing more than the gold industrialists instead of allowing the silver ones that everyone else to have their fair say in the war. And Hanna would end up, for McKinley, during McKinley's campaign, he would portray McKinley as the protector of America's financial interests, mostly due to his history with protectionist tariffs. And in the end, McKinley ended up edging out Bryan. It was somewhat of a close election. It was not a landslide victory for McKinley at all, by any means. The popular vote was actually very close, and you even had a third-party bid by what was called the Populist Party, which was mostly by American farmers and other people who felt disgruntled with the other two political parties and were more down-to-earth, a little bit even progressive in a way. Not fully like the later Progressive Party would be, but very much kind of down-to-earth, not so much the influence of the big cities and the big wealthy industrialists. And this was something that the populists had. And they did not gain any kind of a sizable victory. They didn't even gain a state, but they did have enough of an impact to sway the popular vote in a certain way. And the final popular vote counts in total for the 1896 election. There were 447 electors. You need 224 to win. McKinley ended up winning 271 of those electoral votes, so he clinched the majority, with Bryan coming in at 176. So it was a win, it was a solid win, but not a massive landslide win in any case. And with the popular vote, McKinley only gained 51% of the popular vote. Bryan came in with 46.7% of the popular vote. Comparison. So that brings us to McKinley gets elected. So he's going to take office on March 4th of 1897. He is now in the president's office. And among his very first things that he's going to do upon gaining office into president is McKinley is going to urge tariff reform. And he stated that the currency issue would have to wait for tariff legislation to begin. He stated that the U.S. wanted no wars of conquest in his inaugural address, as calls for American imperialism were becoming quite routine. And ironically, that was going to be the very thing that was going to dominate McKinley's presidency, and his promise of no wars of conquest would end up kind of McKinley being backtracked on. He would very much go on a war of conquest, initially not by his own choice, and he would long pledge that it had never been his choice for the outcome of that war. But it would end up becoming the dominating feature of his presidency, which we'll get to here shortly. So soon after taking office, McKinley called a special session of Congress in order to have them come in and start the process of raising customs duties. He thought that this could reduce taxes and encourage domestic industry growth and employment here in the States. What resulted was the Dingley Tariff Act, which would ended up coming into law by July of 1897. Which was the highest protective tariff in history, even higher than McKinley's McKinley Tariff Act had been in 1890. And the Dingley Tariff Act would strengthen McKinley's support from organized labor. It would actually strengthen his support in this instance because at this point it did help the American economy in a good way. Business-friendly administration, however, was not always the best thing because McKinley's administration was very friendly with big business, and this ended up allowing many of those big business entrepreneurs to form magnificent, massive conglomerate trusts of consolidated businesses into one company. And at the time, many Americans didn't see that as a bad thing, but shortly coming after McKinley's assassination, it starts becoming a major strain on the American economy and the American consumer, and Teddy Roosevelt would actually make a massive career during his presidency of going after these trusts, which was kind of ironic. McKinley kind of allowed them to kind of really take off, and then his successor would be the one that put them down. And we'll see that when we get to Teddy Roosevelt here next month, which is probably one of the most famous American presidents that we have not yet gotten to. So McKinley gets his support strengthened through the passing of the Dingley Tariff Act, and his business-friendly administration allows these trusts to really take form, which allows trusts to actually happen. That brings us to possibly the biggest event of McKinley's presidency, the Spanish-American War. Yes, the United States is going to go to war for the first time since the Civil War officially with another, and for the first time since the 1840s with another nation, because the United States never recognized the Southern States, the Southern Confederacy, as a nation. So the last time the United States had actually declared war on any nation was all the way back in 1846 with Mexico, with the Mexican-American War during President Polk's time. So the Spanish-American War would mostly come out of the American attitudes mostly toward Cuba. The island of Cuba was the main concern here. That was where most of the trouble was. And it would dominate for at least about 2 years of McKinley's years in office. So what would happen was events in Cuba drew American attention. Cuba had remained, up until 1898, it had been a Spanish colony ever since Christopher Columbus had landed on the island in 1492. And it was still a Spanish colony at that time. And what ended up happening here is Spain is exacting control of the Cubans, and the Cubans at this point are starting to fight for their independence. They want to break away from Spain and fully be their own country. Spain is not willing to let go of Cuba because by this point, Spain's empire has really dwindled. Cuba is one of the last colonial possessions that Spain even has in the Americas. And so Spain's really wanting to hold on to Cuba. And when the Cubans start their war for independence, Spain is using some of the most brutal tactics possible to suppress this Cuban revolution, this Cuban rebellion against Spanish rule. And this ends up outraging the American public in the United States as Cuba's neighbor to the north, because they're seeing this going on, and they're arguing that we are supposed to be the nation of liberty and the nation of democracy. And they're citing the old Monroe Doctrine of James Monroe back from the 1820s, that, we're supposed to stop European powers from interfering in the New World and the North and South America. Is this not part of our duty? And the American public is outraged by Spanish atrocities that then get highly publicized by yellow journalism newspapers that somewhat embellish a bit to raise public outrage, but many of the accusations are somewhat true. McKinley, however, due to his experiences in the Civil War, despite the American public advocating that they want the United States to intervene on the side of Cuba and get the Spanish out of Cuba, McKinley is not so gung-ho. McKinley has been through war. He fought in the Civil War. And McKinley, because of his experience in the Civil War, he's not really keen on going in and getting involved in another because he knows what war is like. At one point, McKinley had even made something of the remark that he has been through war and I've seen the bodies fall. And I don't he basically stating, I've gone through this, I've seen the bodies fall, I've seen the people die. I don't think I could willingly, as commander-in-chief of the United States military, order young men to go witness what I witnessed roughly 40 years ago. And so at first, McKinley is opposed to getting involved with Spain at all. However, he has cabinet members in his cabinet who are all for it, including most prominently his Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, who actually would end up resigning from the cabinet when the war broke out in order to command his own unit, the Rough Riders. In February of 1898, though, this would all change, because in February of 1898, the United States sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor as kind of just the regular routine, keep an American presence there. Unfortunately, one night, and shortly after it arrived, I think it was about 2 or 3 days after, maybe even a week, but it was very shortly after the Maine had arrived, the Maine ends up exploding in the harbor. And to this day, it's not precisely known for certain what caused the explosion, although the naval report and the accident report seems to indicate it was more likely something to do with the ship's engines. Something with the ship's engines had actually gone wrong and then caused it to explode, killing a large majority of the crew. However, the American public, given the heightened tensions with Spain and the fact that it was in Havana Harbor in Cuba, automatically went to the conclusion that it had been the Spanish government that had somehow torpedoed the Maine and thus destroyed it as kind of a sign to get out of Cuba and leave us, stay out of our business. So the American public very much took it as a message from Spain, even though there's no indication that Spain was involved in the explosion of the Maine at all. But that's what they took it as. The American public is convinced Spain's behind this, and they very much start rallying around the cry, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. That's what they end up going with, is their rallying cry, and it's published in newspapers everywhere. Eventually, McKinley, because of this, cannot, under any circumstance, he cannot really ignore the American public's want for war. And he reluctantly asks Congress in April of that year, I believe it was, let's see here, April 25th. It was late April. He officially asked Congress to declare war on Spain and to intervene in the war in Cuba. Congress would end up declaring war on Spain officially on April 25th. The Spanish-American War, however, is one of the most successful wars in American history, and it's also one of the shortest. It lasted for only a couple months, from early May until mid-August. It was one of the shortest wars we ever fought, and one of the most quick. The United States forces, in the long run, they ended up defeating Spain rather quickly. In Cuba, they occupied Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. They also occupied the island of Guam and seized the Philippines from Spain in the Pacific. So basically, a lot of the United States' territories that we still have, such as like Guam and Puerto Rico, those came as a result of the Spanish-American War, and we still own those two today. Guam is a major military base in the Pacific, and Puerto Rico is still a United States territory that, in my honest opinion, should be a state by now. But politicians want to keep playing politics over the issue. Now, what ends up coming about eventually to end the war is the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris would end up being signed in December of 1898, and it was ratified officially the following February, in February of 1899, by Congress. In the Treaty of Paris of 1898, Spain would officially cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States as basically territories for the United States to hold. And then Cuba would officially gain its independence. However, it would also be placed under, quote, American protection, which kind of was misleading because Cuba, although technically independent, doesn't fully gain any resemblance of independence until about 1902, because the United States kind of and even then it's kind of questionable because the United States had control over Cuba, and it made the Cuban government, when they were writing their constitution, put in what is called the Platt Amendment that basically allowed the United States to militarily intervene in Cuba whenever it felt that something was going on there not to their liking, pretty much. So if the Cuban government, for instance, was taking a course of action that the United States government didn't like, the United States had full-on authority to go in and intervene in Cuba and send the military in. And they did that multiple times up until 1959 when Castro takes power. So the United States and Cuba, they don't have the best of relationship. They never have. I mean, we kind of dominated them for well over half of the 20th century, and it's no surprise to me that the Cuban people were so pro-Castro at first in mainland Cuba after he took power, because they were tired of being subjected to the American domination that had plagued them ever since they had officially gained independence from Spain. Because to them, it was kind of a slap on the back. Because, the United States says, oh yeah, we're coming in to help you win your independence, only independence to come. And the United States, yeah, hold it right there a second, because you're still going to kind of listen to us. It's not the best thing. And we could do a whole video on that in the future of going into the affairs with the United States and Cuba. It's not the most pretty picture. And also, around the same time that the Treaty of Paris ends up being signed, Hawaii is officially annexed at about the same time by the American government at that time, which we did a video about a month ago on the whole coup in Hawaii that eventually culminated with Hawaii's annexation. So as of 1898, Hawaii gets annexed at about the same time that we acquire Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain. Now, opponents of the Treaty of Paris would argue that it made the United States no different than the imperialist kingdoms and empires of Europe, and that this was not the American way, that a democratic country should not seek to have colonies, as they were pretty much were. However, the majority of Americans would actually support acquiring the territories to avoid being surrounded by imperialist empires. They did not want to, they already knew that France, Britain, and Germany, and even Russia to an extent, were already establishing large colonial empires, and they felt that the United States, if it didn't move to quickly seize any sort of land at all, would soon find itself surrounded by hostile powers. So this was their way to kind of say, well, now we can have our own little colonial possessions to safeguard against that. Was it the best option? Probably not. And for a while, and for these territories in particular, I mean, some of them are still territories. Now, most obviously, the Philippines are not. The Philippines actually were granted their independence right after World War II. It had been scheduled before, but then World War II happened and the Japanese took over, so we had to liberate it first. And in 1946, the Philippines was officially granted their independence, and they even made territorial currency for those territories. And I did not think to grab it here, but I am going to grab it. I have from when one of my grandparents passed away, I actually found, when we cleaned out the house, we had found a bunch of old currency, and among the pieces we had found was a silver peso of territorial American Philippine money from 1911. So this is very shortly after the Spanish-American War, and I am actually going to go grab that right now, because I did not think to grab that in the first place. All right, so I did go and get that thing. Took me a minute to find where it was. Go ahead and take it out of the thing here, because it was out of the thing when I found it. I just put it in a cover so it was a little better protected. But this is a silver territorial peso from when the Philippines was a U.S. territory. This was a 1911 one. On the back, it actually has United States of America 1911. You can get that. I don't even know if that's coming in good. I think it is. But this would be shortly after the United States acquired the Philippines during their war with Spain. So that would be a result of that war, is that we started having territories overseas. Now, McKinley sided with the majority of Americans who thought that it would be essential that the United States gain a territorial empire for the purpose of protecting itself. And he ended up supporting behind them, and when a nationalist insurgents began uprising in the Philippines shortly after the conclusion of the war, because the Philippines had tried to declare their own independence during the time, and they had tried to say, no, we should be a sovereign nation just like Cuba after this war, and the United States says, nope, you're ours now. And the Filipinos decided, instead of fighting the Spaniards, who are now gone, we're going to start fighting the Americans, and they very quickly turned the tables, and McKinley ended up sending troops to quell that national insurgence, which would last until 1902. Now, in 1900, McKinley would also send troops to China to safeguard American interests along with other international powers during the Boxer Rebellion, which was a national uprising against foreign powers having a big, wide open door, just absolute economic advantage and taking advantage of China. And this was a nationalist uprising against those foreign powers and their presence there. And McKinley and the troops that he sent were able to put down the Boxer Rebellion in China. And McKinley, during his further negotiations with the country, tried to pursue an open door policy that was open and fair to all countries around the world to do business in China in order to help ensure that the American position in world markets was strong in that sector. In 1900, McKinley chose to run for re-election, but before we continue, I will show a few images. So here we have, let's see here what we have here. Come a little later here. And I can come up to this point, I guess. That print off twice? It did. Just mistaken on it. Okay, so we have here. Here's an electoral map of the 1896 presidential election that saw McKinley get into the office. As we can see, kind of fairly divided. I mean, it does look like there's more blue, but also look at the electoral counts. McKinley did get more of those higher electoral counts, where a lot of these western states aren't that high. Didn't really gain ground much. And here we have an American cartoon of kind of this is before the war, but alluding to the situation in Cuba, with Cuba being oppressed by the Spanish. It's reaching out across the water for Colombia, who's offering her helping hand. But while Uncle Sam up here is like blind to the situation, not paying attention to it at all, and even though he has the big guns, and could easily solve a problem. So this just reflected the American attitude at that time, that the American public wants to help Cuba, but the U.S. government is like hesitant. And then here is an image of the USS Maine. This was the battleship that ended up exploding in Havana Harbor and ended up causing inadvertently the breakout of the war, because many Americans thought that Spain had blown it up. We now know it was probably the engines, but many of the people at that time did not know that. So, as I mentioned, in 1900, McKinley decides to run for re-election, and again, his Democratic opponent is once again William Jennings Bryan. So he's running in a rematch of 1896. He would end up, however, the big change that McKinley would really put forward with the 1900 re-election campaign was he had to choose a new vice presidential running mate. In 1896, he had Garrett Hobart, who ended up actually dying in 1899. So the vice presidency office at that time could not be easily refilled unless a new election was coming up. So McKinley chooses his former Secretary of the Navy and then Spanish-American war hero, Teddy Roosevelt, to be his new vice presidential running mate. And there are members of the Republican Party who are not all for putting Roosevelt on the ticket, because Roosevelt's kind of a frontiers guy. He's a cowboy. And some of them were very iffy about the possibility, what if Roosevelt gets in the presidency? Boy, were they in for a shock here in a few months. And in fact, one of the arguments I believe that was mentioned to McKinley at one point was someone had legitimately asked him the question. He was like, have you realized if you get that there's only one bullet separating you between that you and that cowboy from the presidency? Do you realize there's only one bullet separating you and that cowboy from getting the presidency? And that ended up happening. But he once again faces off against Bryan, and the election would pretty much reflect the public satisfaction with the war and economic prosperity, because McKinley's first term had been a rousing success in the American public's eyes, and McKinley did end up winning the re-election in 1900 to an even wider margin than he had in 1896. So the United States is going into the 20th century officially. We're leaving the 19th after all this time, and we're going into the 20th century, which ended just about 24 years ago. But in the 1900 election, the vote counts were as follows. Again, 224 votes are needed out of the 447 available electoral votes. McKinley ended up winning 51.6% of the popular vote. Bryan only 45 65.5%, and the electoral vote was even wider this time. McKinley ended up securing 292 electoral votes to Bryan's 155, so an even wider margin of reelection this time around. The second inauguration would take place on March 4th of 1901. McKinley would end up embarking on a tour of the western states where he met cheering crowds as a response to his reelection. However, upon returning back home to the eastern United States, McKinley decided that he was going to attend the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, New York. And this would end up kind of being a sad event. And before we conclude here is an image again. This is an image from McKinley's re-election campaign, but basically touting his success during his first term, that he had brought success and prosperity. Why would you want to change the road now? So on September 5th, 1901, McKinley was at the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, New York, and he ended up giving a speech to a crowd of over 50,000 people on the 5th. The very next day, on the 6th, McKinley decided to attend a meet and greet of sorts, and he was standing in the receiving line inside the Temple of Music building on the grounds, and he was greeting people as they came up to greet the president. You come up, meet him, shake his hand, and it was a big public event, a big affair for the public to meet the president. And while he was in the receiving line, he extended his hand to greet an unemployed Detroit mill worker with a bandaged hand that looked like he was simply, had some kind of injury to his hand going on. The man was Leon Czolgosz, and he was a self-proclaimed anarchist. And Czolgosz was a presidential assassin, because in this bandaged hand, his hand was not damaged at all. He had a gun. As McKinley extended his hand to greet Czolgosz and to shake his hand, Czolgosz extended his bandaged hand and fired twice at point-blank range. Both shots hit McKinley in the chest, and McKinley collapsed. The crowd then proceeded to clamber on top of Czolgosz, and McKinley, remarkably, who is, just been shot twice, instead of being concerned for his own health, he yells to the people that are helping. He's like, "Do not let them harm that man." Like, dude, you just got shot twice by this dude, and you don't want no harm to come to him? We don't even know what's going to happen with you. But Czolgosz had shot McKinley twice in the chest. The doctors then attended to McKinley. They were able to remove the bullets that had been fired into his chest, and initially, McKinley would actually seemingly recover from his wounds that he had suffered. Unfortunately, gangrene ended up setting into the wounds from the bullets, and McKinley would end up his conditioning worsening, and eventually he ended up passing away on September 14th of 1901. Upon his death, Theodore Roosevelt would become president of the United States and inherit the presidency. Czolgosz was eventually executed in October by electric chair, and then because he was so hated, he ended up having his body had acid poured on it to disfigure it as much as possible so that he couldn't become a martyr to anarchists. So, unfortunately, McKinley was riding a high for his presidency. He had just got a second term. He was very good president. Today, he's even known as the idol of Ohio because he is such a prominent figure from Ohio in its history, and the state actually adopted the red carnation as its state flower because of McKinley's habit of putting a red carnation in the lapel button of his suit every day. But unfortunately, he becomes the third president to die by assassination, and we will not have another presidential assassination until 1963 with John F. Kennedy. And that pretty much wrapped up McKinley's presidency, unfortunately, because Theodore Roosevelt is now going to finish that second term, but McKinley ends up dying, and they end up burying him in Kent, which I've had the honor of actually seeing his tomb. And I do have on here, which is actually where I got the shirt I'm wearing. But here, I also got this from the library when I went 3 years ago, and this I wear it on my hat, but this is supposed to be a replica of a 1896 campaign button for McKinley that might have been around at the time. It's just a pin. You can get there. I don't know if they still have them. Then here we have an image of McKinley, this was taken just probably a couple hours, if not minutes, before the shooting actually occurred. This is him actually walking up on September 6, 1901. This is him walking into the Temple of Music. So this is just before the shooting. This is on the very day of the shooting, McKinley walking in there, where the meet and greet will be. And this is an illustration of what happened with Czolgosz. Czolgosz had walked up, as we can see here. McKinley had gone to shake his hand. Czolgosz's hand is bandaged, and he fires the pistol twice from within that bandage right into McKinley's chest, which ends up ultimately killing him from the gangrene that comes from the wound. And this is an image of the tomb over in Canton that you can go see. And the very front of it almost looks like the National Mall, like a miniature National Mall from DC. Almost the front of it does, like out looking on the grass lawn that it has going toward it. So yeah, that wraps up President William McKinley. A great president, unfortunately cut short in his time due to an assassin's bullet. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, or anything of that manner, feel free to put those in the comment section below. I don't know what video we're doing next week yet. I'm trying to decide on what topic that will be, so I don't have anything to lead on right now. So hopefully everyone continues to do well. And we will see you all back here next week for whatever video that might be. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, a good finish off to August, and we'll see you back here next week.